Greetings. In this video I combine parts 2 and 3 of the Green River killings, reporting by Thomas Guillen and Carlton Smith from the Seattle Times. They start off talking about a setting made for murder, and they start talking about the legal system, the criminal justice system, and how the nature of how prostitution took place, and how the laws regarding prostitution were enforced actually worked in favor of the Green River killer. For example, there's a case that's presented of Giselle, who was arrested, released, and then later abducted by the Green River killer and killed. The authors refer to the scenario as a losing war. Prostitution arrests increased as well as the number of prostitutes. And also prostitution was linked to pimps, drugs, and escape from abusive homes. Now, from a sociological standpoint, I think it's also important to look at the socio-economic aspects that were currently going on at the time as well. And also we'll see later there was a lack of services for these prostitutes. So, for example, the Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 1977 made it more difficult for law enforcement to address and deal with runaways and abused children. And the Green River killer, as we know, preyed on young women and teenagers. And so the authors point out that the system was dysfunctional, and other problems occurred that made it a lot more difficult for law enforcement to catch the killer. For example, car dating was very popular, and so prostitutes would hop in a car with a John or a man who was purchasing the services of the prostitute, and then they would go into a area or a hotel for sex, and that of course makes it difficult to keep track of what's going on. And of course, prostitutes and law enforcement do not necessarily have a good communication system established for looking at illegal activities. And there was also the thought that the Green River killer might even be posing as a police officer, and for example, the police would handcuff and fasten the seatbelt during an arrest of a prostitute who gets into a car, and the prostitute would usually think that they were getting arrested and were going to be processed through jail and the criminal justice system, or released once brought down to the jail. But in this case, they also might think that the Green River killer was an undercover officer, and therefore would offer no resistance or not be prepared for the attack that was about to occur, that they would be trapped in the car in that sense. And bodies were discovered, and now we're moving into part 3. And the case really became problematic because the system could not figure out really how all this was happening, and of course who the killer was. And there also was a lack of individuals in the King County Police Department who specialized in these types of cases. And a lot of their, or they had some very experienced homicide investigators who had left their jobs and for other jobs, and so that can be a problem as well, especially in what we might consider to be unusual and rare crimes. Serial murder is not a common crime. And the FBI created a psychological profile for the police department, and it consisted of some of the characteristics. A white male, 25 to 35, and prostitutes made him very angry. That probably wasn't all that helpful. Also, the press wanted a lot of information and in some cases disclosed stakeout areas where the police were working. So there were a lot of system-related problems. It's possible that while one body was being investigated, the killer might have been discarding another body of one of his victims nearby, and the killer carried out his work in a similar manner, and the prostitution decoy operation stopped due to the dangerous nature there, and consultants recommended having a better communication between prostitutes and law enforcement to try to understand what was going on, who went missing, how it happened, where it happened, what could be some of the areas where they might go. So some would say, well, what would have happened if the prostitution arrests decreased or stopped and more Johns were getting arrested? But we did see that law enforcement did decrease street prostitution, but this didn't necessarily lead to a, as we'll see later on, a decrease in the murders or the murder stopping. Also, like any other city, that there were priorities where law enforcement was directed to address, and much of the time of vice officers was taken up in gambling and massage parlors, according to the authors. And also they often did not work on weekends, which is when the victims tended to disappear. And there's a task force, of course, formed, as mentioned before, although it disbanded after they thought the killer had left the area. But we see what the authors refer to as a shifting scene. The bodies of 3 women are discovered, and then prostitutes start getting fearful and leaving the area. And then also with false names created, there are problems for the police in trying to identify the victims. And the authors also present a case in the actual articles of a frustrated family who go on a search for their missing daughter. That kind of gives you some of those dynamics. I do want to mention a couple things, though, and that is a lot of the material on the serial killer is from that I'll use later on, as after they catch the murderer, is Thomas Goulian's Serial Killers: Issues Explored Through the Green River Murders, published by Pearson Prentice Hall. I've used this before in my classes, and this is really an excellent book, but I would be remiss without mentioning the excellent book written by Sheriff David Reichert, My 20-Year Quest to Capture the Green River Killer. I'm sorry, it's called Chasing the Devil, My 20-Year Quest to Capture the Green River Killer. And really, I think you need to look at both of the books, because sometimes there's the impression that the police were not doing enough, and I think that's very false. I think they were doing all that they can, and they were putting their lives on the line and working extremely hard to try to solve this murder. And it's extremely frustrating when they run up against all kinds of problems related to press releases, to city management and administrators telling them to do this rather than that. What's clear, though, is that Sheriff Reichert really kept on task and worked an enormous, long period of time doing all that he possibly could to catch the Green River Killer. So I think that's important as well. What I've identified in a lot of this case are systemic problems within the system that you come up upon. If you're a seasoned law enforcement or corrections officer or someone who's been working in the field for a number of years, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When I worked in forensic mental health and child protective services, I realized that as well. It was the system. The system will just drive you up the wall because you find that it sometimes is irrational and there's problems and there's roadblocks. And that's important to recognize too, because those and turf battles and things of that nature, when people ask why I left the system and went into teaching, you know, my response is, where else can you sit behind a camera, drink coffee all day, wear a grungy t-shirt, not shave, and get paid? That's really not the reason I left. The reason I left is because the system really stressed me out with how bizarre it was. And so I have plenty of cases that I won't talk about because that's not the focus of this. But what I do want to mention is that a lot of my failures I would attribute to problems within the system. And those are problems as a criminal justice professional that now I analyze and I try to solve. So I don't want you all to get the impression from the excellent journalism that's done here that the police weren't doing much. They were. And they were doing a lot and a lot of effort. And we have to remember that there are all kinds of other criminal activities going on at the same time. And there's limited resources. And so a lot of this has to do with, trying to figure out how to balance things out to keep the community safe as the major goal. So I thought that's just important to mention that, you know, these are very different books, and I think getting the different perspectives, the perspective of just journalists who really followed the case carefully, and the detective who really went after this case and did everything he possibly could do, and finally saw that the Green River Killer, as we'll see, was put behind bars. And this wraps up for parts 2 and 3. Thank you.